want to welcome everyone to our second Scholars in the Square lectures for this semester. Hello to those of you joining us online tonight and in the future on YouTube. My name is Rachel Brown, and I am the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at UVic. Now, as a reminder, our SIT format unfolds as follows. First, our speaker, I'm having the tech issues. Bouchra Mossmann will offer a 20-minute public presentation, and then she will engage in a 20-minute period of conversation with Dr. David Atkinson, professor and former chair in the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria. David's primary research interests are high latitude and high altitude weather and its impacts on human activity, and his region of specialization is the Arctic. And his first northern field season was in a tent for 3 months on Ellesmere Island in 1990 for his master's thesis work. And since then, he has worked with communities in Western Alaska and Western Arctic Canada. So to say he knows the lay of the land for the context of tonight's talk would be an understatement. Now, after Bouchra and David talk for 20 minutes, I'll chair a 20-minute open discussion period. So our speaker for this evening is Bouchra Mossmann. Bouchra is a final year PhD candidate at the Center for Modern Middle East and Muslim Studies at the University of Southern Denmark, working with a longtime friend of the CSRS, Dietrich Jung, and she is a Scales Family Fellow at the CSRS this year. Her research focuses on lived experience, small-scale context, migration, and community-based work, and centers on Muslim subjectivities in Northern and Arctic Canada. She is particularly intrigued by post-colonial and decolonial approaches to place, spatial concepts, and embodied research methodologies. She holds a BA in Islamic Studies and History from the University of Fribourg and a Master's in Middle Eastern Studies with Advanced Arabic from the University of Edinburgh. Bouchra has lived and studied in Cairo, Beirut, Amman, Denmark, and across Canada, and has professional experience in the social sector as well as an interpreter for Arabic, French, and English in Germany. Now, as I said last week, one of the best things about the CSRS is the truly interdisciplinary nature of our community and research programming. This week, we have another wonderful pairing of a geographer with a scholar of religion and Islamic and Middle Eastern studies. Now, while they share a passion for water in all its forms, and while Bouchra and David know the context of the Arctic quite well, they come at this space from completely different viewpoints. So what a treat to be able to bring these two together and to witness the magic that can come from this kind of interdisciplinary engagement. Now, as we all see, and as I mentioned above, Bouchra's work emphasizes post-colonial and decolonial approaches to place and to research. Her work with Muslim communities in the Arctic also involved going through extensive training and ethics protocols on conducting research in a good way on Indigenous lands. And so I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, the Songhees, the Sepsim, and the Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Now please join me in welcoming Bouchra.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Thank you very much for the generous and warm introduction, Rachel, and then acknowledgement, and to Todd and Scott for making this logistically possible, to the CSRS and specifically the Scales family represented by Peter today, for hosting me as a grad fellow at the center, and a lot of gratitude also to my supervisor, Professor Dietrich Jung in Denmark, who presented at the Scholars in the Square this past spring. And of course, to all of you here in the room and online on Zoom, showing your support joining today. Let me warmly introduce you to a topic for which I've chosen a rather cold title, North of Ordinary Muslim Lives in the Canadian Arctic. Before delving into the focus of my studies, namely Muslim communities and individuals in Northern Canada, to be precise, Yellowknife, Inuvik in the Northwest Territories, and Whitehorse in the Yukon. Here you can see that I would like to start by giving you a few pieces of context and maybe a glimpse into a felt sense of the North. So during the past weeks leading up to this talk, there were intense cold snaps with temperatures in Inuvik around -40 to -45 degrees Celsius around January 6th. This is also the time when the sun starts to reappear after weeks of darkness and polar night, and the town comes together to celebrate the Sunrise Festival. The end is marked with fireworks, which had to be postponed by several days this year due to the extreme cold. Here you can see the Facebook post of the town of Inuvik, and then the fireworks finally taking place. And the stunning photographs are actually by Sami Inuvialuit, photographer based in Inuvik, by the name of Christian Binder. This is his Facebook account, and I highly recommend checking out his work. It's truly stunning. The other photographs in this presentation are either screenshots or taken by myself. So the extreme cold also has operational consequences in other areas, such as a pool closure, the closure of the public swimming pool of the town of Inuvik, and ongoing issues in the gas supplies for the town's heating over the past couple of weeks that are still yet to be resolved. So we have these issues alongside, the Sunrise Festival, people going to work, dropping their kids at school, going about their daily lives. And these overlaps of vulnerability, celebration, routine, and adaptation are central to what I want to talk about today. And this brings me to the title, North of Ordinary, which is also the slogan or the name of a magazine produced in Whitehorse and distributed on Air North flights. And I find it analytically useful as it gestures toward a sense of Northern self-understanding that is characterized by resilience, self-reliance, and community spirit, but also towards an everyday life that is lived under very different conditions from what might be familiar to many of us. With a geographer in the room who has a long-standing expertise in climate, weather, and northern infrastructure and operations, I'm sure we will have an interesting discussion after the talk. For now, I just want to emphasize that the North is not just a backdrop for my study, but actively shaping social, cultural, and religious lives. I'm interested in how Muslim newcomers encounter a multi-layered Northern context, indigenous histories, settler colonial governance, climate extremity, small community dynamics, and how they become part of that, are shaped by it and contribute to it. So rather than an approach that looks at Muslims as a horizontal layer here, I am trying to take a vertical or cross-sectional approach. And while Todd in his talk last week was connecting geopolitical aspects to lived experience and religion, I'm looking at the convergence between religion and place, climate, and everyday practice today. So what happens when we take religion as something lived and embodied in a particular environment? Before digging deeper, I want to give you also a brief impression of a deceptively simple question that shaped my look at the context that I just illustrated. What is North? Klaus Dodd's The Arctic, a very short introduction, reminds us that Arctic can refer to latitude, climate zones, tree lines, or geopolitical regions of strategic interest. Very relevant. We look at the latest events in Greenland. Think of references like north of 60, the Arctic Circle, or subarctic climate zones. These definitions often overlap and contradict one another. There are trees in Inuvik because it is located in the Beaufort Delta, so the tree line goes further up. And here again, we can see that in one of those images, photos taken by Christian Binder. On Facebook, in the comment sections, you would find people arguing that this cannot be the Arctic and this cannot be Inuvik because there are no trees. So the conclusion is simple but important. There is no single North, and there are multiple overlapping Norths: climatic, political, cultural, and lived. Across geography, literature, and the arts, the North has long been fetishized, imagined as vast, empty, or extreme. The authors of recent publication called Rethinking the Great White North criticized this. There is another example, which is not so recent, from 2007, Cheryl Grace's Canada and the Idea of North. And comparable dynamics appear in European and Scandinavian imaginaries. Klaus Henningsen, for instance, describes the North as simultaneously a promised land and a harsh exclusionary space, what he calls like a bright and a dark North. Contemporary Northern exceptionalism, he argues, is often more fantasy than reality. So the imaginaries revisited by these authors are not harmless. They have been influential, producing racialized, gendered, and political understandings of northernness intersecting with whiteness, masculinity, endurance, or national innocence, marginalizing indigenous presence and other non-white settler colonialist lives. Indigenous voices articulate a different epistemology or different epistemological understandings. Yellowknife-based Dene First Nation musician Digawol, for instance, in his song Northern Love Affair sings, "The North is my home, snow nights and winter cold, spirit and soul, we were here before, the midnight sun, elders, and the drum." Authors like Leanne Simpson, Tanya Tagak, and Richard van Camp foreground relationality, continuity, affect, and everyday intimacy, not emptiness or silence. So Muslim newcomers in the North are not a horizontal layer added onto that neutral or a neutral space, as I said before, but they enter spaces that are already saturated with meaning, history, and power relations, and they inhabit them in ways that complicate dominant imaginaries and narratives. I will save you more on the theory, positionality, and methodology, as well as the academic contribution of my project here, so that we have time to go into concrete examples from my data collection, but you're very welcome to pick up on these aspects later during the discussion. And the same applies to the history of Muslims in Northern Canada, which I think I've focused on more during my last Scholars in the Square talk about 1.5 years back. So I will just quickly say a few things on who my interlocutors for the project were. They are majority first generation, mostly coming relatively directly without bigger transit stops in southern cities to the north, often employed in government or self-employed or in the service industry. There are several economic and social aspects of attraction to the north. They emphasize shared values with local communities. Generally, there are more men than women, but the communities are highly diverse ethnically, culturally, linguistically. So Muslim communities in the north are very small still. You can see the total numbers of the population, and then after that, the number of Muslims and the number of interlocutors per location. So there's roughly 150 Muslims in Inuvik, 700 in Yellowknife, and 200 to 250 in Whitehorse. Now I want to turn to the central claim organizing my empirical material for this talk, which is that Muslim life in the Canadian North is characterized by constant embodied negotiation and renegotiation of religious authority, personal faith, and pragmatic compromise, often in more existential ways than in places with more established religious or communal infrastructure and familiar climate conditions, and additionally layered onto issues of immigration and minority contexts. I'll illustrate this with 4 examples. The first, let's start with faith practice, which is foundational as prayer, ritual, and religious observance are inseparable from the physical realities of Northern life. Prayer timing and direction pose a unique challenge under polar night and midnight sun. There are different religious authorities prescribing different solutions. So the 3 communities that I worked with took different approaches. In Inuvik and Yellowknife, there were community boats that eventually settled for Mecca, like following Mecca timings in Inuvik, and an alternation of Mecca timings and local timings in Yellowknife, which is now also ISNA, Canada, Islamic Society of North America, Canada, mediated as the community of Yellowknife got a salaried ISNA imam. And then these community boats, which I find very interesting, and that's also a community member from Inuvik emphasized that, are very open to renegotiation in the sense of that depending on the sectarian dynamics of the community and sort of like if there is a scholar with a better justification or like sort of a new insight in what should be practiced, the community is very open to discussing it again, sitting down and then taking a new vote. So it is not once and for all settled. That was a very interesting aspect I observed. And then also that the votes were meant to be made by the community members who are regularly engaged in the community, who are actively contributing and not just being mobilized to come to the mosque for this one vote. When it comes to the second example, supply chains and access to resources, halal food availability is uneven and expensive. Bulk orders from southern provinces are very common. People compromise ethically and emotionally, depending on their personal comfort level, and in ways rarely visible in southern cities. So, for instance, a group of teenage girls described that they constantly had to check ingredient labels and sort of the limited availability of familiar halal snacks that they knew from Edmonton. Heating, housing, and mosque construction are similarly shaped by climate and cost. The Midnight Sun Mosque in Inuvik is not just a building, but it is an infrastructure that is requiring constant maintenance and planning. For those interested in learning more about the history of or behind the construction of the Inuvik Mosque, I can recommend the documentary Arctic Mosque by Saira and Niloufar Rahman from Winnipeg. Several Yellowknife residents described rents requiring 2 full-time incomes, buying a home as especially difficult for Muslims to avoid interest-based mortgages, etc. So food and housing insecurity also intersects with broader northern realities. Since 2015, the Arctic Food Bank in Inuvik, coordinated by locals in partnership with the Muslim Welfare Canada, provides halal food hampers without income verification to several hundred registered families biweekly, and between 60 and 120 collect basic staples regularly, and those include both Muslim and local families. Limited public transportation makes mobility without a car difficult. There's scarce repair services, whether for cars, plumbing, household needs. So all these sort of like very material, practical aspects that require constant negotiation with ethical and religious needs. As for the third example, thermal, I like just phrase that as thermal comfort or discomfort on a personal level, or the seasonal changes, how they affect life physically, work, leisure, and sports, even workplace choices, gendered mobility, where can Muslim women go to work out, the swimming pool, things like that. I've also heard cab drivers emphasizing that they really like their work because it didn't require them to be outside much in cold temperatures and dark environments. So there's a lot to say about that as well, but unfortunately, I cannot go into much detail. But very welcome again to questions during the discussion. And finally, the last example, community, solidarity, and co-presence. Small northern communities make social engagement and solidarity highly visible. A Whitehorse resident reflected on those, on opportunities for civic participation, saying, "The voice is heard here in Whitehorse. When I was waiting for my wife's papers, they suggested I reach out to the member of parliament." That really sped up the process. They really follow up. So sort of like distances between offices are short. People know each other. Another emphasized the speed and weight of social networks, how word travels fast and your voice matters. And there is a sense of cross-cultural solidarity also that shapes daily life. So with folks saying some of the things that Indigenous have in their culture, you find in Asia too. There are many shared values in terms of community, in terms of respecting elders, and coming with a sense of allyship or a shared reality from intergenerational trauma at the hands of colonialism, and a consciousness of ongoing white settler colonialist practices, but that curiously also intersects with colonialist realities of labor and chain migration that folks participate in, right? So community is built through, or like in Northern Canada, community visibility and relational engagement structure the possibilities of inclusion, comfort, and ethical action. And community is built through doing together, such as hunting, fishing, crafting, food banks, protests, mutual aid and fundraisers, shared spaces of education. There are so many examples to this. So what do these 4 themes show. Prayer, food, clothing, work, civic participation all intersect, creating a lived environment that is socially and ethically charged, materially constrained, and relationally rich. And this is a North as lived and not imagined. And I'm saying a North as one of many Norths. And it is precisely through these everyday practices that Northern Muslims produce subjectivity through belonging, solidarity, and resilience. And I want to end by briefly stepping back and asking why this work matters more broadly. The idea of Muslims living in the Arctic still provokes reactions of surprise, even disbelief among Southerners and sometimes among Muslims themselves living in the South. I've been asked questions like, wow, there are Muslims up here or up there, or do people, even things like, do people still live in igloos? What's striking is that these are not relics of the past, like they are very contemporary expressions of how little is known, not only about Muslim life, but also about northern regions more generally. And for me, this work is about zooming in on the North as a place of ordinary lived social life and recognizing how dominant imaginaries and narratives continue to flatten that. Writing and researching Muslims in the North forces me to rethink where Islam is located, how religion is lived under unfamiliar circumstances and conditions, and how migration, minority life, and settler colonial contexts intersect in places that are often left out of national narratives. Methodologically, it pushes me towards small-scale, community-centered and relational approaches. And in terms of scholarly contribution, it speaks directly to gaps in the literature on Islam in Canada, on lived religion, and on the social worlds of the Arctic, showing that what happens north of ordinary is not marginal, but analytically important in my eyes. Thank you very much.
Bouchra will have 20 minutes to chat together.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Yes, so I don't just work in the North. Before I was at Victoria, I worked at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and dealing with weather issues. I had a minimum standard thermometer at my house, so the coldest temperature I measured was -55 in my house. And if you don't plug your car in, you're in big trouble. And that's sort of, you know, and you touched on some of these issues of sort of extreme environments. And so, you know, what stems from that is in the North, you know, and you mentioned resilience of the people up there, as well as that, you know, a hallmark of the North is a certain self-resilience in the people. And you know, people need to be ready. So I drive around on my Subaru, and if I hit a moose, I had to be ready to be in -40 for potentially an extended period of time. If the power goes off, you know, you showed the examples from Facebook where they're having trouble with the gas supply. So you need to be ready for these sorts of things. So there is that sense of resilience. But I found that it also translates into a certain sense of pride. You know, it's not just an operational requirement. It becomes an identity. You know, I'm kind of ready and I'm self-reliant and so on. You know, the resilient Northerner. And I was wondering, how did you see this translated into the Muslim community? And I kind of have two senses to the question. How does the community function in the relative absence of more overt structures and even the presence of a formal leader like an imam? How does that translate, or does that translate into a certain sense of pride in what they build for themselves, such that if an imam does get posted and start to change things, they say, you know, we like the way we do it, actually.
Thank you so much. Really interesting questions. And to answer sort of like the first part, I really agree with like that sense of pride and self-reliance, or that comes from that self-reliance. And I do see it translated into the Muslim community in such aspects as not only the engagement with the broader community, or seeing sort of like a responsibility of giving back and becoming part of this sort of larger framework of depending on each other, stepping in for each other, offering services to each other and support, but also in a religious sense or on a religious note, in the way that faith practice is much more challenged than elsewhere. So a pride comes from saying we are some of the very few Muslims here. So the way we represent our religion, our faith is really important because we are very visible. In a sense, also, it translates into a pride of being the ones who sort of like introduce or familiarize folks with Islam in the north. And then obviously in the example of Inuvik, the Midnight Sun Mosque, priding itself to be the northernmost mosque in the Western Hemisphere. That could be contested if you count the mosque in Tromsø in Norway, but at least the northernmost mosque in North America, that is for sure. And I think that is also translating into a big sense of pride. And these challenges being challenged in the faith practice, I observed is either, but in very few instances, becomes challenging to an extent that makes people decide or wonder whether Allah has really prescribed it for them to be this far up north, and if they should not rather leave, or saying like this is where the real challenge starts, and this is where I can prove that my sort of like my ethical considerations and my individual practice really translates into something meaningful. And that obviously goes with authority and community leaders and the way they are engaging. And I've certainly heard from community leaders saying that the needs of the congregation are very different from what they've experienced in southern context.
Yeah, in terms of community building, one, like in Fairbanks, you get quite a range of communities. There's the university community, then there are the folks that say no trespassing and you do not trespass. Drive around in the pickups or the Subarus. But what was interesting is that if it's minus 40 and you're slid off the road, nobody asks your politics. They just stop, hook up pull you out. And it was also interesting in a place like Fairbanks, they really know how to make their own fun, and it really didn't matter who's at the table. It's if you live there, then you're welcome to join. And so I found it interesting when you mentioned that they've introduced halal food baskets.
Yeah.
Saying, well, these folks are here, and so we're just going to bring them in. That was nice to hear.
Yeah, and there's many more of these initiatives or examples. It's not only food hampers. We also have this program where they hand out sort of like backpacks for kids when it's the back to school time. In Yellowknife, there's events like regular fundraisers or distributions of meats when they have Eid al-Adha or sort of like these. I would say it goes along with this sense of giving back to the community with a sense of responsibility, and certainly one could ask also with a sort of wanting to represent a different picture than what folks know from the media and the media representation, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just in listening to you just now, it occurred to me, I mentioned this, but the idea that they are the first, so they're the example, so they're what people they'll be their template, so it's almost a higher level of expectation or something with how they engage or behave. Not that they wouldn't anyways, but it's, I don't know if they're conscious of that. It seems like they are a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it also translates into something that just makes me think of a question that you asked, like when we prepared for this presentation, right? About the inward and outward aspects of religion and sort of, I mean, let's say the communal aspects of it and then the personal individual practice. So for instance, I like when I was at a women's circle in Yellowknife, like there were these negotiations of, okay, I want to be a good mother, and I want to like bring Islam to my kids in a way that is practicable to them. And at the same time, I'm meeting so many challenges here that drives them away from the practice because it's getting so complicated. What do I do with the prayer times? And do I compromise with my kids? And I say, okay, I'll go with the easier choice for them. I'll go with Mecca so that they can have a shorter fast, but then do I break my fast later or do, sort of like, do I maintain the unity of the family against my own personal conviction and sort of what this practice means to me. And I think there are so many like very little examples of trying to fit these negotiations into the rhythms of everyday life. And I mean, also in the winter when the prayer timings are so close that they fit into a window of a few hours,
Yes.
right? How that would disrupt a work day, a school day. I've heard some teenagers say this never gets us a routine. Like if we want to pray regularly, and that is the idea of a prayer, like in their interpretation, that it structures the day, that it gives a sense of a routine, but following that throughout the seasons would just disrupt that routine. Rather than creating it. And I think these are very, small but very tangible examples of what that can translate into.
Let's see. So I guess, back to the first question, sort of extending it, I guess, for a little bit. Just one of the articles that you had sent me, it comments on an analysis framework that embraces ambiguity in religious practice. And I think, you're just getting on touching on that it's kind of made manifest. So I was going to ask, how does the isolation of the Muslim communities in these towns contribute to ambiguity? But it's perhaps not so much isolation, it's the geographical positionality, vis-a-vis the planet and the sun and so on. That's causing problems.
But it definitely has an aspect of isolation to it as well, I would say, in the sense of, I mean, that as I said, like communal and religious infrastructures are less readily available, they are less established. So these mosque communities, they've just sort of, I mean, formed over the past decades, and only since the early 2010s, there is these purpose-built mosques available in the territories. So that definitely comes with a sense of ambiguity, because the sort of like the authorities are not yet very established. Many communities still rely on someone from the community leading the prayer, taking turns. Sort of like it's a very community driven and self-reliant again nature of communal life that I think is speaking to this isolation aspect. And
I could see multiple levels of isolation. The Nuvik is isolated, but then even within a family, the mother is feeling a little isolated because she's struggling with how do I live faith the way I see it, but at the same time keep my kids on a coherent schedule, that sort of thing.
And absolutely, and I think something else you mentioned here, which is interesting, is isolation on different levels, not only translating into this individual isolation on many different levels, but then also what we talked about with communities being isolated in different ways. I mean, we're only looking at the so-called hub communities here because they are the ones that are connected enough to have a Muslim population coming into labor migration and sort of, I mean, we are talking about the territorial capitals, we are talking about, I mean, a small town as Inuvik, but still being a center for the surrounding communities that are not as accessible and not as inhabited by Muslims. And so this north that we are now discussing is definitely also different from what you might have experienced and seen in much smaller communities, right?
Yes, actually, yeah, that almost leads into this question, which is perfect. So yeah, like you've just noted two kinds of communities. These small places that are not connected and which are almost exclusively indigenous communities. So, I mean, I think you mentioned farther north of Inuvik are places like Tuktoyaktuk in the Mackenzie Delta, Sachs Harbor on Banks Island, Luchakto on Victoria Island. Sachs and Ulu are completely disconnected. There is no road link, and they're very small. And then Tuk is interesting actually because until recently there was no road link. I mean, you could drive on the river and then on the ocean in the winter, but the ice road. But now there's a road link, and I'm wondering what will happen to Tuk over time. You know, it'd be an interesting community to observe. Actually, will there be an influx of Southerners of Muslim people, you know, as part of that? Or is it simply just too off the beaten track, you know? So with these two types of communities, and then there are the bigger places like the Yellowknife and the Whitehorse and so on. So, and I guess I think you've touched on this. You know, how homogenous are these areas, and then what does it mean for to operate in a mixed congregation in the midst of a wide range of non-Muslim peoples?
Yeah. I think that is something, I mean, like first to touch very briefly on the idea. I mean, I've known or had the chance to meet a family who actually lived in Ulu for 2 years and who, described a very different picture from what I've heard from interlocutors in Inuvik or the bigger cities, because like even things as simple as just having hard drives to watch movies for the kids, because satellite television or internet connection, etc., wasn't as readily available or as stable. And just being the very, very first Muslim family who had ever lived there, and sort of like explaining things like, why do I have this scarf on my head? Or like a very, and what stood out for me, what I found striking was that in a way they also said, but the other teachers that were posted into the community from outside, they had similar questions, even though they came from metropolitan areas in Canada. And then what you mentioned about like the sort of the size or the different access and connectedness of communities, I think what is interesting to see is this point at like how much does it take for a very diverse congregation to fragment into like, you know, smaller pockets of ethnic or language-based sort of like communities, and that is something that is definitely happening in Whitehorse and Yellowknife much more than in Inuvik. In Yellowknife, there's a special case because the new Islamic Center is still under construction, so there's sort of like a common grievance and longing for a community place. I think that is a bit more unifying, but you can definitely see that with growing numbers and with more connectedness comes this sense of fragmentation.
One more question, maybe, David?
I do. Yes. So, and this I think might sort of segue into opening up the discussion a little bit. That was the thing to take this question. But so this is a quoting a quote that you had made, which was a quote from somebody else. He became a vital part of the local community, earning its respect and welcome by allowing himself to be absorbed into Indigenous and not settler Canada. Following his invitation, more friends and family members from Sudan arrived and made the community grow. And so, I read that and thought, okay, well, what does it mean for this person to be absorbed into Indigenous Canada as a Muslim? And then I just put out there that it's not really a comment that I agree with because, like this is being engaged in the very act of colonialism, that more people end up coming. And these are people who've relocated from, they have traditional land, they have their homelands. These are someone else's traditional lands in a sense. And so then to come and say, oh, I'm allowing myself to go into Indigenous ways. It just seems like a funny contrast. So not necessarily a question, but an observation. People can pick that up, I guess.
Do you have a comment?
Yeah, can I unpack it?
Yes, sure.
I need another 5 minutes, please. No, I think to put this into context, like the quote is actually taken from a book, one of the very few books that addresses these contemporary communities and the community in Inuvik. It's written by an Edmonton-based journalist, and it's called Praying to the West. And the quote, I took it from the book because what I found interesting is definitely this, as I mentioned before, this sort of like sense of responsibility to giving back and to, learning, finding ways of connecting through this shared reality. And at the same time, this intersection with sometimes a lack of consciousness of what happened. And maybe ignorance and that a Dene First Nation activist from Yellowknife pointed that out to me. And it's just, I've been reflecting on it for a while because they said that there's yet not really any education for newcomers on Indigenous histories, on traditional liveways, all these sort of things. So people do arrive with a sense of ignorance and with an unawareness of being a settler to a land. And I mean, in many cases, they are refugees, or they are like themselves in a way compromised in their way of staying on their traditional lands. So I think that plays into it. And then I'm also wondering, like, are we the right ones to ask these questions? And that's why I would like to read a quote from Patty Kravitz, Becoming Kin, because this specific sentence got addressed by her as well in the conclusion. And she writes, I hope this is not too long, but it's not that long. So there's a mosque in Inuvik, a community in Canada north of the Arctic Circle. In Praying to the West, Omar Muallim talks about the members' relationship with the Inuit and migrants who call this town home. He quotes Abdallah, a Muslim man who runs a food bank and who says that their dawah, the propagation of Muslim faith, is not by preaching, it happens by becoming part of the community, giving back to the community. Muallim observes that by allowing himself to be absorbed into Indigenous and not settler Canada, and by becoming a vital member of it, Abdallah had earned both the Inuits' knowledge and welcome. So it's the same quote. This isn't a universal practice. Elsewhere in the book, there are examples of colonial behavior, of a hyper-patriotism likely born of a need to feel safe, to be the good ones. But reading this, I had to wonder, what if Christians had entered Indigenous communities in this way 500 years ago? What if Americans and Canadians, settlers and migrants, sought that kind of relationship today? What would be possible?
Thank you, Bouchra. That's great. So we can open up so we can open up to a broader conversation now. Yeah, please.
Sure. First of all, that was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. Just to your last point there, and just for background, I'm an Arctic anthropologist, and I've worked in the Arctic for 25 years, and I specialized in early Christian and Inuit conversion in Northern Labrador. So I spent a long time reading mission journals. And while you were talking, I was thinking, this is exactly what the Moravians did. Like exactly. Like that what they did was to model a kind of Christian life and draw converts in. Like it wasn't the same kind of active conversion that you get from other. So it's quite, I mean, that is what they did, right? They have sort of form of charity. And it results down the road in this idea of what like Robert Payne called welfare colonialism, which is a more like nuanced way, I think, to think about colonialism. And I appreciated your question about settler colonialism and whether that's the right kind of category now, maybe whether that's because I've had the opportunity to travel with a lot of Muslims in the Arctic and had a bunch of clients who've been, and I've been surprised at how much racism they've experienced, like even in my presence. So you didn't comment on that. I was wondering maybe you could, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that again ties into what I mentioned earlier, this lack of education on Indigenous history, and on the other hand, a lack of education on Muslim history or non-Western history and civilizations and cultures at the hands of like Canadian education or Western education, and how, yeah, there is just a lot of mutual stereotyping and prejudice and racism going on because both sides have been sort of like socialized into the same hegemonic settler colonialist narratives. So I feel like that there is this part of it. Then from my experience with interlocutors, interestingly, they sort of relativized their experiences of racism or Islamophobia, in the sense that there was always this sort of like comparative component with, okay, but in the South it's much worse. And here I can also understand there's this intergenerational trauma. And so yeah, just kind of like focusing more on a sense of allyship and these like very outright racist narratives, but those are definitely also present. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for this presentation. I was thinking about that map you showed of Yellowknife and, oh, there we go. Yellowknife, Whitehorse, you have Iqaluit, and you have Inuvik.
Yeah.
Could you say something a little bit more about the origins of migration or settlement from Muslim communities, when the first were, what their reasons or motivations were? You touched on Sudanese and some refugees, so I get a sense of that, but could you maybe expand that a little bit in terms of when people came, what the reasons were over time?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for pointing that out. It's really interesting and also a bit difficult because I mean, obviously these communities are right now more concerned with survival than with documenting themselves. So like statistics and just oral history and all these sorts of things need to go together to actually find numbers, to find the origin of Muslims. And I think what ties into this especially is also that many adopt Western names, so it's very hard to trace, and there's practically no written sources. So when I dug through the archives to look if there were any Muslims in the Northwest Territories or in the Yukon historically, I mean, obviously I went back to the history of Muslims in Canada and the Edmonton community, which was already quite northern, right, as one of the first, like with constructing a Rashid Mosque and is like institutionalizing. But yeah, I mean, the very few folks that I could find back then were Lebanese fur traders. And then there's a large gap where we can assume that there were probably people working in the gold mines in Yellowknife, for instance, and sort of these things. But then my own interlocutors and sort of like the story that they told was mostly that the Muslims And some of them are still present in the communities today, arrived around the late 80s and early 90s. And yeah, that is what I can work with. But I mean, obviously, there's much more that I could say on this. I don't know if I should or if we should take more questions.
Just a follow up on that. I wanted to know kind of how many of the people living in the north among your discussants how many are from Southern Canada or North America, and how many are from outside of North America and come, it sounds like someone came from Sudan to the Arctic versus someone, growing up in Toronto and moving to the Arctic.
Yeah, I would say the majority is really first generation, which means that they have been born somewhere else and came as newcomers, immigrants to Canada, and then mostly also with relatively short stations in southern cities. They went north because mostly of work opportunities, good salaries. Often university graduates find better positions that less competition. Sort of like there's a whole bunch of economic aspects that attract. And that is certainly interesting because I think just now there's a second generation of Muslims that have been sort of like raised in the north and that are like, I mean, from really just baby age till I would say approximately around my age in their mid-30s. So that is the generational line where we can cut. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Bouchra. So Paul and then Kila.
Thanks for that, Bouchra. I wonder if you can speak a little bit more about the experience they would have of the weather. I mean, David mentioned minus 55. I've hit minus 53, but that's with wind chill in Winnipeg. But I think people from Victoria, Vancouver, Toronto, Southern Ontario, all of Southern Ontario, they can't quite understand the experience of opening the door and feeling like the world wants to kill you. Like just the air wants to kill you. And it's a real shock, I suppose, coming from Sudan or Lebanon or wherever they come from. So I wonder if people speak about that, because we think about sometimes the category we use at the center, of course, is like cultural Muslims, people who practice kind of casually, if at all. I wonder if that experience of going into this territory where like the world wants to murder you changes their experience of Islam. If then they have to grapple with such a kind of an ambient hostility. So I wonder about that. But then I want to contradict myself and ask a separate question and wonder if some people say, oh yeah, like the Quran is a text written in the desert for a desert culture. And I was in Marrakesh and it was 44 degrees. It felt to me like the world was trying to kill me. Just getting to the plane, I thought I was going to die. So I wonder if some of them say, oh yeah, this feels very familiar. It's a different, the sun sets at a different time, but otherwise the outside world is hostile.
No, thank you so much for this. And I think it ties into something that we've been discussing about the ice desert. And you can say more to this.
Yeah, I mean, the north is very low in precipitation. The driest weather station in the country is actually off the map, farther north at Eureka. So it's called the polar desert. So in a sense, that aspect of aridity does prevail, and there are a lot of vistas that are, we were discussing this. Like BC is a place that sort of challenges your physicality. You climb the mountains and you kayak over raging waters and so on. But a place like the north, you look out on a plain, and you know that if you walked for days, that view would not change. That challenges your spirit. And I would imagine it's similar in the desert. If you look out over the Sahara, you can just keep going, and that vista never stops. But it's just
no, thank you, because this is really like, I mean, some folks have been sort of like comparing their experience of fishing in the Nile to fishing in the Mackenzie. And so I would think that even though, it's often referred to as a freezer and it's like so cold and exceptionally cold, but again, it ties into that sense of pride. We can sort of like brave that and into, sort of like a different experience of spirituality in many cases related to that view over a very vast plain, sort of like icy landscape that brings up very existential questions, or just driving through the Yukon, seeing those mountains, and then feeling sort of like reminiscing about certain surahs in the Quran, and how that connects to God's creations. And I feel that, I mean, certainly weather and landscape and physical environment, they do spark that.
But you mentioned the Northern Lights as well.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
true. As one of the wonders,
Kikila, please.
Thanks for that, Bouchra. This was awesome, and David, your questions have been really interesting as well.
Thank you.
So you mentioned this negotiation of practice, right? Like of being so far from Mecca, let's say, that, and with such different like timing with the sun, there has to be this negotiation around practice. Like, and I would pick on Christians, but they were crafty enough to come up with a Christmas tree. So are we maybe, like, is this a negotiation with the like limits of place bounding in religion, where you get like a spiritual practice or spiritual framework that comes out of a very particular place, like Paul used about the desert, and now like through globalization and all these other reasons, it's being brought to these spots where like even like astrologically, it almost doesn't make much sense for that religion to be practiced there. So like with the negotiation of the sun and there not being sun for 6 months, do you think there's something to be said about the like limit to portability for some of these like place bound, maybe, or place invented or conspired religions?
Oh, thank you. There is something that I've touched on earlier a little bit, maybe about some folks, seeing this challenge and saying like, sometimes we really wonder if Allah has prescribed this sort of environment, and at the same time, then thinking about like, but no, the Islam is a very sort of like universally applicable religion. So this is exactly where we should be to be practicing it, and then going back in history and trying to find sort of like historical descriptions of this land without a sunrise and a sunset that Muslims would enter eventually. And I mean, I think it's that there is manifold interpretations and sort of approaches to that.
Thanks for that. That's super cool.
All right, Shubham, last quick question.
Okay, so on this map, we see some non-Muslim interlocutors for you. How do they define a Muslim experience there? What questions did you ask them, and why you chose them? Just curious about your implicit methodology.
That was really for me sort of to get context. So I've tried to find like interlocutors from either local indigenous governments or artist activists who were sort of engaging with the Muslim community through the Palestine protests, or other sort of like community level interactions where that would intersect. I was also trying to get an impression and idea of several of the Christian congregations in town in Inuvik. So talked with some representatives, just also with representatives of general infrastructure such as the town and the literacy council, who would be dealing with newcomers. Just sort of like whatever I could get, let's say, not very systematically, but to get as much context as possible.
Thanks, Bouchra.
I wanted to back to Carrie's comment. Another, I think I'm not sure of the word Qibla.
Yeah, the direction of prayer.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
maybe mention what you told me about the maps and trying to get the direction.
Oh, yeah, like, I mean,
Just an interesting.
that as being so close to the North Pole, I mean, first of all, obviously, if you go to the North Pole, then
Well, the Mercator projection.
yeah. So yes, they like the sort of accuracy to define the Qibla, the prayer direction, closer to the pole, becomes less and less accurate with sort of like apps and things like that. And so it is really that's something that's been addressed in a really interesting and great book by Tammy Gaber. It's a coffee table book with some hundreds of mosques all over Canada, I think hundreds or at least dozens. In the case of the Inuvik Mosque, they had to bring in a scholar who would with that Mercator map, like based on that, like sort of with that scientific approach to really just define where the Qibla would be, which can be very different from southern locations, and it would just point due north, which is the shortest distance to Mecca.
That's great. All right, well, thank you, Bouchra. And thank you. Please join us next week, same time, same place, for Peter Evans.
Just looked over and there was my face.
Yeah, Invitation and Scapegoat includes Salish Schmidt. So join us next week for that. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.